I want to start with really understanding trauma from a somatic perspective, so a somatic definition of trauma. So trauma are experiences that leave us with contractions that are non-responsive to current time experience. So let me unpack that for a minute. So experiences that leave us with contractions, that could be numbing, that can be over containment, that can be just kind of like a running hypervigilance in the soma. So these contractions become non-responsive to current time experience. They don't take in new information. And then that survival shaping, right, or those survival strategies generalize themselves and keep going even when they are not effective and maybe even don't create safety in current time. Okay, so that's really what somatics is looking for when we're understanding trauma and how those strategies generalize and then obviously cause hurt, pain, suffering, a limited amount of choices when we're caught in those survival reactions. Okay, traumatic experiences really break apart safety, belonging, and dignity and can literally put them at odds inside of ourselves, right? Or inside of our clients and the people we work with. Now, that is a problem, right? When we go safety, belonging, and dignity are all constitutive and inherent needs. If they start battling inside of us because of traumatic experiences and them being shattered, it's almost like a no-win. So let me just give an example. So for some people, their survival strategies after trauma around safety is I can only be safe if I'm alone. Now, meanwhile, that need for belonging and connection didn't go anywhere, but these two become embattled internally. So I'm going to isolate to be safe, which then causes this very big breakdown around belonging and the need for intimacy and connection. Or we'll often see in survivors of child abuse or intimate partner violence that connection, I'm going to stay connected and actually give up my own sense of safety, or I'm going to stay connected at the expense of my dignity. And then connection and staying connected becomes one of the primary drivers in a traumatized system. So when safety, belonging, and dignity get broken or shattered because of trauma or systemic trauma, and then end up vying or battling with each other internally, it causes a lot of distress and a lot of suffering for the person. In the big picture, which we'll talk about later in this module, at a very simplified level, healing from trauma is reweaving the coherence between safety, belonging, and dignity, and having them again become co-serving inside of our systems, inside of our lives. All right, so I want to continue here in this somatic definition of trauma. So trauma is also an individual and a systemic experience. And we really began to unpack that with sites of shaping and sites of change in the last module. But we can really look, there's very individual experiences of trauma, like something as deep and individual as child sexual abuse. And when we look at it through those sites, we can also see that it's a systemic experience because of the sheer numbers of children who are sexually abused, and then the social norms that keep perpetuating denial, minimization, and a power over system, of which child sexual abuse is one expression of violence. Or when we again look at white supremacy and systemic racism, all these systemic expressions of social norms, right? Who deserves safety, belonging, and dignity, and how that gets expressed through institutions can cause trauma for people who are impacted by white supremacy. Okay? So trauma is both an individual and a systemic experience. Now, the difficult thing is that most traumas are caused by other people, right? So most trauma and violence is done to people at the hands of other people or caused by human-created systems, right? So that is the bad news. maybe part of the good news is we can have some hand in changing that as well. There are also traumas caused by natural disasters, by massive weather events, which also kind of tail back to human systems with climate change. And then there can also be necessary medical interventions that still leave someone somatically traumatized or with an experience of a threat to their safety, belonging, or dignity. So the important thing to recognize is that trauma impacts us holistically. Again, our thinking, our emotional range, how we make contact or not with other people and build relationship. And it lives deeply in our tissues, right? We can't think our way out of our trauma-informed survival strategies. It's just not even the same part of the brain and nervous system. Our muscle memory, right? Trauma lives in our muscle memory. So because it's such a holistic experience, we also need to heal holistically to really have traumatic experiences be part of our lived experience, but not really driving our lived experience. All right, great. With that, I want to shift and kind of go big picture again and talk about systemic trauma. What is systemic trauma? So systemic trauma is the ongoing exploitation, degradation, disrespect, lack of access to basic needs, including safety, belonging, and dignity for whole groups of people, right? So that's why we have to kind of back up and go, wow, what are all these causes of trauma? And look systemically. As we've discussed, there's many state, economic, and historical causes for systemic trauma. What's important also to link together is this impacts and breaks down the safety, belonging, and dignity of whole groups of people. Sometimes groups, whether it's based on race, class, region, take on collective survival strategies. And those survival strategies can even be passed down culturally or, of course, through practices within a family or within a community. Survival strategies can be passed down through families, through communities, and even through culture when a people has had to sustain violence, oppression, colonization, slavery over generations. So one of the things in all of our cultural locations is we want to be able to look and ask, it's like which of these cultural practices are promoting healing, agency, liberation, and which of our cultural practices might be promoting separation, internalized oppression, even strategies of privilege, which I also want to talk about. So peoples in power over systems who are granted more privilege and systemic access. So in the United States context and globally, whites, cisgendered men, heterosexuals, folks with more access to money, right, wealthier people, that also shapes us. And that shaping is also has a traumatic impact just in a very different way. Privilege shaping can be a shaping of separation, of better than or above than, or a real numbing of empathy for all peoples or for life. So depending on your social location and depending how you're shaped by systemic trauma, there might be very different transformative work to do. So we're focusing this program on more therapeutic and healing approaches and interventions, but I also want to take a moment about why understanding somatics, trauma, and healing is so relevant for those of us who are really committed to social justice and social change. So this shaping from trauma and oppression can deeply impact how we actually understand and perceive change. It can really impact our visions for change. And I think many of us at this moment in social change kind of history, again, speaking from the United States, inherited a bit of a separation between structural change and personal change. That even shows in our therapeutic traditions that often we're not trained in social change when we're highlighting or focusing on personal transformation. But why this bridge is so important is who we are as social change agents, how we're shaped affects the visions we come up with, affects how we can build relationship and actually organize thousands and millions of people, and can especially affect how we are in conflict with each other. So trauma and the impact of systemic trauma, understanding it can really inform strategies, approaches, and the ways we go about creating wider social change. Let me give two examples here. So if, because of the impact of systemic or personal trauma, if a social change leader or an organizer or even a whole organization, if under pressure, the impact or the reaction is to fight, fighting is a great strategy for social change, but not all the time. And that can also get kind of packed in or built into the culture of the progressive left. So we want to, like we said before in the healing process, have a number of options for reading the current time situation, understanding what we're working with, and then choosing the most skillful action or strategies. So we don't want to be caught in any automatic reaction or survival strategy that actually came from trauma or systemic trauma. And then I'll say one thing about this from therapy. You know, I've had many social movement leaders or organizers come to me and say, hey, I tried therapy, but what my therapist suggested is I should stop doing social change work because it's so stressful. And so sometimes in therapeutic work, we don't get trained again to see the bigger picture and the bigger shaping, or look perhaps for solutions that are more individualistic than someone who is working for the collective, that might be effective for them. So this being able to scale between the I, the relationship, and the we, or individual healing and social change really is important for social change work and also for healing and therapeutic work. So an example that I want to use, and there's a really awesome public report about this, so it's already in the public domain. But we at Generative Somatics partnered with the National Domestic Workers Alliance for a number of years in their leadership development program. And we integrated all this work around somatics and trauma in working with their leaders. Their member leaders are nannies, cleaners, domestic workers, right, and home healthcare workers. And one of the lines I love that they use is, they're the workers who make all other work possible. So we would do these 20-day leadership development programs that would last over a couple of years. And when we were really looking at the impact of the multiple traumas that these majority women had faced, there were migration and immigration traumas. Often people had experiences of child abuse, child sexual abuse, or domestic violence. Often these were women who were migrating to get out of poverty and get their families out of poverty and send a huge amount of their money home. We can look at the conditions and context for that, again, of colonization, or how the systems of global capitalism work. So we're talking multiple personal and systemic traumas. And what we found, if I think about the first group of like 70 people who went through that long training, is that under a lot of pressure, not everyone, but if we look at them as a group, there would be a response of appeasing or shrinking. And if we look at domestic workers' rights, domestic workers' dignity, the work that makes all other work possible, that appeasement was not aligned. It was aligned with survival. It was aligned with shaping from all those conditions, but it wasn't aligned with their collective vision, which is dignity for all domestic workers, workers' rights, right? Pay, vacation time pay, sick leave, right? All the labor rights that were won in the United States actually in the 40s, except to get it past domestic workers and field workers, right? Farm workers were left out of the equation, which is very much connected to slavery, right? And the dynamics of slavery in the United States. So domestic workers and farm workers have continued to need to fight for their labor rights. So appease and having appeasement not line up with the vision and values is one way of why understanding trauma healing is so relevant. Just an example about why it's relevant for our social movement work. All right, so that is a very big definition of trauma through an embodied lens, and also a lens that helps us have a social analysis. The next segment will be about understanding fight, flight, freeze, appease, and dissociate, which are the automatic, biologically driven survival responses that come in the face of trauma.